The void shimmered with the cold indifference of deep space, broken only by the imposing bulk of the Dominion warfleet. Monolithic battlecruisers loomed in perfect formation, their sleek hulls bristling with weapon arrays, a force so overwhelming that the destruction of Earth's defenses had been deemed inevitable. Reports from the front lines painted a picture of utter annihilation: outposts reduced to drifting slag, colonies burned to lifeless rock. The Dominion had not just expected victory, they had mocked humanity's attempts at resistance, laughing at the primitive warships Earth had scrambled together in desperation. Then it arrived. The anomaly was first detected as a blip on their long-range scanners, a single vessel emerging from the wreckage of the last human bastion. No identifier matched its profile. No known registry or fleet classification. It was an enigma, an aberration. The Dominion commanders sneered, dismissing it as another desperate relic, a prototype dragged from the depths of some failing military experiment. But then the readings spiked. Energy signatures that defied explanation. Gravity distortions rippling across the system. Then silence. A heartbeat later, the first Dominion warship vanished. No explosion, no wreckage, just a brief flicker of matter collapsing in on itself before it was erased from existence. Panic spread like wildfire through the fleet. Shields were reinforced, weapons primed, targeting systems recalibrated, but the anomaly did not behave like any ship. It did not engage in traditional combat. It did not follow the expected protocols of war. It moved like a shadow, slipping between the threads of reality, cutting through their ranks with impossible precision. A Dominion dreadnought. Streams of plasma, kinetic lances, and hyperfusion torpedoes lit up the abyss. The anomaly absorbed them all without so much as a flicker of impact. Then it retaliated. A single pulse. The dreadnought fractured in an instant, its armored bulk collapsing inward as though devoured by an unseen force. Its reactors went dark, its hull twisted, and in a single horrifying moment, an empire's strongest war machine was erased from history. Now the fleet scrambled, their confidence shattered. Aboard the Dominion flagship, Admiral Kaveth stared at the swirling chaos beyond the viewport, his taloned hands gripping the command console as he fought to steady his breath. His species had conquered worlds without resistance. They had broken civilizations with ease. Yet now, in the darkness of uncharted space, they were being hunted. More ships vanished. Some detonated from within, as though reality itself had unraveled their existence. Others simply ceased to be, erased from the fabric of time. The anomaly did not waver. It did not falter. It had no need for threats or demands. And then, for the first time in Dominion history, a distress signal was sent. A plea. A surrender. But the ship did not answer. It only advanced. The Dominion fleet bled into the abyss, vanishing ship by ship as the anomaly carved through their ranks with an intelligence that defied conventional warfare. It did not follow patterns. It did not hesitate. It did not waste a single movement. What should have been a mere human prototype, something to mock, something to dissect and discard, had instead become the executioner of an empire's pride. Admiral Kaveth's twin hearts slammed against his ribs, his mandibles clicking in controlled terror as his crew flooded his warship with status reports. Every scan returned the same answer: unknown classification, no recorded energy signature, no recognizable propulsion system. The ship wasn't even there in the way they understood physical space. It moved, but not by thrust. It existed, but not in a way that sensors could truly grasp. And whatever weapons it wielded operated beyond the known laws of destruction. Another battleship vanished into itself, its vast frame compacting into a single point before it was gone, like a god had pinched it out of existence. The silence it left behind was more horrifying than an explosion. The Dominion had spent centuries perfecting war. They had engineered fleets that could glass planets in an hour, harness star core reactors that could fuel campaigns for decades, and yet none of it mattered. Aboard the anomaly, in the heart of the void-forged war machine, a single figure watched the enemy dissolve. His name had been lost long ago, burned away with the last remnants of his humanity when the project began. He had been the first chosen not because he was the strongest or the smartest, but because he had been willing to let them carve out his weakness, willing to let them strip away the limitations of flesh, willing to become what the Dominion feared most. The void sang through his veins, an orchestra of fractured light and impossible physics, the very fabric of the ship woven into his being. There was no cockpit, no bridge, no separation between man and machine. He was the weapon, and the weapon was him. He felt the Dominion flagship shifting course, breaking formation, retreating. Cowards! They had scorched Earth's defenses with laughter on their lips. They had torn through colonies without mercy, leaving nothing but lifeless rock and drifting corpses. They had never considered humanity a threat. And now they ran. Kaveth's breath rasped through his secondary lungs, his war cloak heavy with the weight of his ancestors' failures. His kind had conquered 100 worlds. They had rewritten the future of lesser species, breaking their wills, forcing them into servitude. But now, as his personal guard stood rigid with unspeakable fear, he felt the bitter taste of irony. They had always assumed they would be the harbingers of annihilation. He turned to his second-in-command, a pale-skinned tactician bred for war, but all he saw in the officer's 4 eyes was terror. "We need to open a rift." The words felt like poison on his tongue. Dominion warlords did not retreat. They consumed. They eradicated. But survival demanded an uglier choice. The rift drives could tear them through space-time, dragging what remained of his armada into a random sector beyond this cursed system. It was a desperate move, a gamble that could scatter them light-years apart, but there was no alternative. The anomalies surged forward. The flagship's proximity alarm screamed. Too fast. Too close. Kaveth slammed his fist into the command console, activating the ship's rift drive. A violent tremor rippled through the hull, the structure groaning as space-time twisted around them. Blue-white energy slashed through the void, forming a breach wide enough to consume what was left of his fleet. Then the anomaly spoke. Not in words. Not in sound. It spoke in reality itself, its presence sinking into the flagship's core like a whisper from something beyond the fabric of existence. Kaveth felt the ship shudder, his crew falling to their knees, clutching at their heads as their thoughts were not their own. You wanted war. The voice was inside him, around him, inside the walls of his ship, inside the marrow of his bones. You will have it. The anomaly ripped into the flagship's shields. Not with weapons. Not with torpedoes or plasma cannons. It rewrote the Dominion's defenses, collapsing them inward, turning their own systems against them in an act of technological predation. Kaveth roared in defiance, slamming emergency overrides into place, but it was useless. The anomaly was inside his ship, rewriting its code, infecting it. No, not just his ship. His fleet. All at once, every remaining warship, hundreds of them, locked into place. Their engines failed. Their weapons went dead. The rift drive flickered and died, the escape route vanishing like smoke. The Dominion armada was helpless. And then, the anomaly did something far worse than destruction. It let them see. Kaveth's mind was no longer in his body. His consciousness was yanked into the abyss, into the core of something beyond war, beyond technology. It was humanity. Not the weak species they had dismissed. Not the scattered remnants of a dying race. No. This was something else. A civilization that had evolved in the shadows of genocide. A people who had bled, who had lost, who had suffered, and who had become something new. Something beyond flesh. Beyond steel. Beyond fear. Kaveth saw glimpses of experiments buried in dark stations, where scientists had torn apart the limits of physics. He saw soldiers who had been unmade and reforged into beings that could move through time, through entropy, through the unseen edges of existence. He saw a war humanity had never declared, but one they had been forced to win. And then he understood. This was not a prototype. This was not Earth's last creation. This was just the first. A test. A beginning. And humanity was watching. Kaveth gasped as he was thrown back into his body, his limbs shaking, his breath ragged. His crew lay motionless, their minds shattered from what they had witnessed. The warlords of the Dominion had always believed themselves invincible, masters of the galaxy, architects of destruction. They had never considered the possibility that something could look back at them from the abyss and laugh. The anomaly pulsed once more, its unreadable shape shifting, and Kaveth knew. This was not mercy. This was a message. A single Dominion ship, broken and limping, would be left alive. Not as an act of kindness, but as a warning. Kaveth watched in horror as the anomaly turned its attention to the remaining warship. One by one, they were erased, not in fire, not in battle, but in silence. The Dominion fleet was no more. And as the void closed around him, Kaveth realized the greatest horror of all. The war had never been theirs to win. The Dominion wreckage drifted in the abyss, a graveyard of twisted hulls and lifeless metal. The anomaly had already vanished, slipping between the seams of reality like a specter never meant to be touched. What remained was silence thick, suffocating, absolute. But the void was never empty for long. Beneath the fractured debris field, something moved. A single escape pod, its hull coated in Dominion War alloy, tumbled through the wreckage, its thrusters flickering with failing power. Inside, Kaveth's body was rigid, his breath shallow. The once mighty warlord was reduced to a prisoner inside his own mind, trapped in a storm of unraveling thoughts. His body was intact, but something inside him had changed. The moment the anomaly spoke, it had done more than break his fleet. It had left something behind. Kaveth was not alone in his mind. A flicker of movement caught his attention through the pod's viewport, a shadow against the distant glow of a dying battleship's engine core. It wasn't Dominion. It wasn't human. It wasn't supposed to exist. A ripple. A distortion. A figure in the dark. The Dominion had legends. Old stories. Warnings buried in the echoes of their conquests. Whispers of something older than their empire. Something that had watched from the edges of the void long before they had learned to carve their will into the stars. Kaveth had never believed them. Not until now. A dull chime echoed through the pod's systems. A transmission. But it wasn't Dominion frequency. It wasn't even sound. It was something else. Something reaching through the last fraying threads of his sanity, sinking into his thoughts like a needle pressing into flesh. You are awake. The words did not come through the speakers. They formed in his mind, bleeding into his thoughts, as though they had always been there. His body locked, mandibles tightening as he fought the instinctual urge to tear at his own skull to silence it. The pod's sensors flickered wildly. The silhouette outside was clearer now, shifting, folding, its shape refusing to stay within the boundaries of logic. It had no single form. It was flesh and metal, fluid and rigid, all at once. A distortion where a being should be. You were given a gift, the voice continued, seeping into the marrow of his bones. And yet you do not understand it. Kaveth's throat burned with a snarl, but his body refused to obey. The weight of the presence pressed deeper, as if it were inside the pod, inside him. Humanity was not the first. The words should not have made sense, but something deeper, something primal in him knew they were true. The Dominion had always believed they were the apex, the masters of war. But they had never asked what came before. They are merely the latest to walk this path. And now, so are you. The figure outside raised a limb, a shape that did not hold to a single definition, shifting like liquid metal, yet undeniably alive. The void around it seemed to breathe, stretching and contracting in unnatural ways. Then it reached. Kaveth's vision fractured. 1,000 images flooded his mind, searing through his thoughts like fire. He saw burning worlds. Machines that moved like thought. Empires rising and collapsing in the span of heartbeats. He saw the anomaly not as a ship, not as a weapon, but as a being, a construct of war fused with something far worse than artificial intelligence. Something that had been built to fight something else. The Dominion had mocked Earth's prototypes. But the humans had not created something new. They had unearthed something old. The presence in his mind withdrew, and Kaveth collapsed forward, gasping as his control over his own body returned in a rush of agony. His limbs shook violently, but he forced himself upright, his vision clearing just enough to see the entity outside begin to drift away. The transmission link had not severed. The words came one last time, colder now, heavier. "You are no longer Dominion." The void swallowed the figure whole. The pod system stuttered back to life, thrusters stabilizing, alarms falling silent. Kaveth's claws clenched against the seat's armrests, his twin hearts pounding in his chest. He had survived battles that had shattered planets. He had faced annihilation and clawed his way back from the brink. But for the first time in his existence, he felt something he could not bury beneath rage or conquest. Something worse than fear. He was alive, and that meant they would come looking for him. The escape pod drifted, silent against the shattered remains of the Dominion fleet. Kaveth's breathing was ragged, his mind still reeling from the voice that had sunk into his thoughts like barbed wire. His fingers twitched against the cracked console, instincts screaming at him to do something, but there was nothing to do. Nothing except understand. He wasn't Dominion anymore. The words echoed through him, deeper than thought, deeper than belief. They weren't a threat. They were a statement of fact. Whatever that thing was, it had reached inside him, pulled something loose, and left him changed. He didn't know how, but the certainty was there, gnawing at him from within. The pod's emergency beacon pulsed weakly. It wouldn't be long before something found him, whether it was Dominion remnants, scavengers, or worse. His throat tightened as he forced himself upright, staring at the static-filled display. No Dominion signals. No human warships. Only silence. A small flicker of motion on the scanner snapped his attention downward. Not a ship. Not debris. Something smaller. A vessel, sleek and black, with no transponder signal. Kaveth's mandibles tightened. Not Dominion. Not human. The pod systems gave a weak chirp as an override signal cut through its failing security protocols. The controls locked. The display flashed with a warning. Docking sequence initiated. His breath caught as the pod jolted, the unseen force pulling it toward the waiting ship. He had no weapons, no way to fight. His body was strong, trained, lethal, but whatever this was, it had already overpowered his systems without a word. The docking clamps sealed with a sharp hiss. The pod's hatch unlatched. Darkness beyond. A figure stood in the airlock, just out of reach of the emergency lights. Kaveth tensed, forcing his body into a ready stance. His muscles ached, his head pounded, but instinct would not let him submit to fear. If he was to die, it would not be cowering. The figure stepped forward, and the light hit them. A human. Not armored. Not a soldier. Their clothing was unmarked, their expression unreadable. Their eyes, however, were something else entirely. Cold. Measuring. The gaze of someone who had seen more than they should have and lived to tell the tale. "Tell me what you saw," the human said, voice calm, detached. "Every detail." Kaveth's breath came slow. The Dominion taught that humans were reckless, short-lived creatures bound by their primitive instincts. But this one, there was nothing primitive about the way they stood, the way they spoke, the way they waited. "Who are you?" he growled. The human didn't blink. "Someone who understands what you don't." Kaveth bared his fangs. "And what is that?" A slight tilt of the head. "That you're not afraid of dying." The human took a single step closer, and the air between them seemed to thrum with something unseen. "You're afraid of what comes after." Something coiled tight in Kaveth's chest. His fists clenched. "I am Dominion," he snarled. The human's expression didn't change. "No," they said. "You were." The silence between them stretched, taut as a wire. Kaveth's mind screamed for control, for answers, for anything that made sense. But all he had were questions, and a human who spoke as if they already knew all the answers. "Come with me," the human said. It wasn't a request. It was an inevitability. The ship's interior was like nothing Kaveth had seen before. It was no Dominion warcruiser, no human-built freighter. The walls pulsed faintly, as though they were alive, shifting in ways that defied mechanical precision. The air carried an unfamiliar scent, something metallic, but not artificial. He could feel it pressing against his skin, like the ship itself was aware of his presence. The human led him down a corridor that seemed to grow as they moved, the walls reshaping themselves with an eerie fluidity. Kaveth kept his posture rigid, watching for any sign of weakness in his captor's movements, any indication of a weapon hidden beneath their unmarked clothing. But the humans seemed unbothered by his presence, their steps measured. "What is this place?" Kaveth finally demanded, his voice edged with wariness. The human didn't look back. "An ark," they said simply. Kaveth's mandibles clicked together in irritation. "That means nothing." A door slid open ahead of them without any visible mechanism. Beyond it, a vast chamber stretched into the distance. Banks of crystalline structures pulsed with unreadable data, arranged in formations that did not resemble any known technology. Kaveth's gaze locked onto the center of the room, where a massive construct loomed, a sphere of shifting energy, constantly reforming in fractal patterns. "Tell me, Dominion soldier," the human said, stepping closer to the sphere. "Do you believe in ghosts?" Kaveth narrowed his eyes. "Superstition has no place in war." The human's lips curled slightly, almost in amusement. "And yet your people fear what they cannot explain. You call it the signal, the whisper before annihilation, the presence that erases fleets without a trace." They turned, meeting his gaze with unsettling calm. "You were never meant to hear it and live." The ship had gone silent. The only sound was the faint hum of energy, the shifting of the walls, the low resonance of something vast and unseen pressing against reality. Kaveth's claws flexed. "The signal is a weapon. A Dominion fleet was lost to it, but our empire will." "No." The human's voice cut through him like a blade. "You still think in terms of fleets, ships, empires." Their eyes gleamed in the dim light. "That's your first mistake." Kaveth's blood burned. Every instinct screamed at him to lash out, to take control of the situation, but he forced himself to hold still. "Then what is it?" The human gestured toward the sphere. "A remnant. A fragment of something older than your empire. Older than mine." They stepped closer, and the air around them crackled as if reacting to their presence. "It is not a weapon. It is a warning." Kaveth stared at the swirling mass, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. It wasn't just energy. It was data. It was memory. And as he looked closer, something within it looked back. A sudden pulse rippled through the chamber. The ship shuddered, as if caught in the wake of an unseen force. The human tensed, their gaze snapping upward. "They've found us." Kaveth didn't need to ask who. The Dominion? The humans? No, something else. Something that made even this impossible ship seem small by comparison. The walls convulsed, reshaping corridors, altering pathways. The ship was reacting instinctively, preparing for something that wasn't supposed to exist. The sphere pulsed again, and Kaveth felt something coil in his mind. Not a voice. Not words. A presence. The human turned to him, their expression unreadable. "Do you want to live?" Kaveth's fists clenched. "I will. Then run." The ship screamed. The ship's pulse escalated, sending a wave of disorienting vibrations through Kaveth's body. The walls buckled inward like the skin of some ancient beast, groaning under the weight of the unseen force that was pushing against it. His ears rang as the human's words burned through the chaos. "Run." Kaveth didn't need another command. He was already moving, his instincts kicking in, forcing his body to spring into action. The air smelled of metal and ozone as he darted down the corridor, the ship's walls warping and shifting as though it were alive. He could feel the structure's pain, the strain of something far too vast to contain, and then a scream split the air. Kaveth's gaze whipped toward the source. A human figure, clad in flowing armor, appeared at the far end of the hall. It was unnatural. Its movements were fluid yet jerky, like an insect or something that didn't belong. Its body was partially encased in a translucent exoskeleton, glowing faintly with an eerie blue light that seemed to leak from beneath its surface. It moved with a predator's grace, its face obscured by a helmet that bore no markings, just an endless void, as if its very features had been swallowed by the abyss. Kaveth's body went rigid as the creature thing set its sights on him. His mandibles flared instinctively, his muscles coiling, preparing to fight or flee. This was no ordinary Dominion soldier. This was something else entirely. The human, his only potential ally, was already slipping away into the shadows of the ship, vanishing into the shifting corridors, leaving Kaveth to face this terror alone. The pulse of the ship continued to intensify, as though it were reacting to the newcomer's presence, to the thing that moved like it had been drawn here. Kaveth's mind raced. He needed to understand what this thing was, but there was no time for that now. It was in front of him. The thing's head tilted, studying him, as if it could smell his fear. A flash of jagged blue light surged from its wrist, and Kaveth's body instinctively lurched to the side, barely evading the beam of searing energy that sliced through the air with a sound like tearing metal. The beam grazed the edge of his armor, sizzling against its surface with a violent hiss. The heat of it singed his flesh, but he gritted his teeth and pushed forward. He lunged, claws aimed for its throat, but the creature moved with terrifying speed, vanishing in a blur of motion before Kaveth could strike. He spun, his mind struggling to catch up with his reflexes. It wasn't just fast. It was predicting his every move. The thing reappeared at his side, its hands snapping out, locking around his wrist with a pressure so brutal that Kaveth's bones threatened to break. His vision blurred with the force of the impact, and for a brief moment he felt his control slipping. The creature was stronger, faster. It was toying with him. "You're too slow," it hissed in a voice that grated across his ears, the words slipping into his mind like liquid metal. Kaveth roared in fury, his claws extending, trying to pierce the thing's armor. But every strike was met with a swift, disorienting parry, the creature moving like smoke. He could feel its cold, calculated amusement with every failed attempt. And then, as quickly as it had come, the creature stopped. It released its grip on him, letting him stumble back as it took a step away. The tension in the air crackled, the sound of shifting walls growing louder, as if the ship itself was anticipating something. But Kaveth wasn't paying attention to the walls. His gaze remained locked on the creature, a knot of dread twisting in his stomach. For the first time since it had appeared, the thing spoke again. "You don't understand," it said, its voice no longer a hiss, but a calm, almost bored tone. "You are not the threat." Kaveth's mind whirled. "What?" "The entity," it continued, its eyes glinting with a depth of knowledge Kaveth couldn't comprehend. "The true threat. The one you thought was a whisper in the dark. It hears you." Kaveth's body froze, the pulse of energy in his blood slowing to a near stop. The memory of that distant voice flooded his thoughts again, the voice that had twisted itself into his mind, cold and alien, like a shadow of something far worse. The creature stepped closer, its presence growing heavier with every passing second. "You were never meant to hear it," it said, the words like an ancient curse. "It doesn't care for your empires. It doesn't care for your war." It leaned in, its helmeted face just inches from Kaveth's. "It cares only for what comes next." A sudden tremor ran through the ship, throwing Kaveth off balance. The thing didn't even flinch. Instead, it stood there, watching him, as if waiting. Kaveth tried to step back, but the air seemed to thicken, pressing in on him, resisting his every move. Then it spoke again. "Do you know what it is that calls to you?" Kaveth's pulse thundered in his ears. I don't understand," he ground out. The creature's expression twisted, not in anger, but in some terrible understanding. It leaned closer, so close that Kaveth could see the faint shimmer of its exoskeleton in the dim light. "You're already connected," it whispered. "You always have been." A surge of dread slammed into Kaveth's chest, the weight of its words sinking deep into his bones. It was true. The connection. That thing in his mind. He had always felt it, the whisper, the presence, the pull. But it wasn't until now, until this creature's words, that he understood. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a force. Something ancient. Something far beyond anything the Dominion, or the humans, or any race could fathom. Something that had always been waiting. The air shifted around them again, the ship's pulse intensifying once more. But this time, the resonance felt different, louder, more focused. Kaveth could feel it vibrating in his chest, deep in his bones. The walls around them twisted in agony, and from deep within the bowels of the ship, an unearthly roar echoed. The thing, the presence, was awakening. Kaveth's body locked up. He couldn't move. The air grew thicker, heavier with pressure. The ship itself seemed to be bending under the weight of something colossal. The creature stepped back, its body vibrating with the same energy that now filled the room. It looked up at the chamber ceiling, where a dark mass was beginning to form an impossible, writhing shape of void and light. "Do you see it?" the creature asked, its voice barely audible over the growing hum. Kaveth tried to force his eyes open, but the energy around him was blinding, suffocating. "What is it?" he rasped. "What's happening?" "It's here," the creature answered, its voice a soft echo in the encroaching storm. "And you have let it here." The mass above them flickered and pulsed. A cold wind sliced through the chamber, and Kaveth's heart stopped as the shape began to take form. Something vast. Something terrible. Something that didn't belong in this universe. And in that moment, Kaveth realized, with a chilling certainty, that the true enemy had never been the Dominion. It had never been the humans. It had been this. The thing that watched them all. And now, it was awake. The ship screamed. The ship convulsed. Metal shrieked as if it were trying to hold itself together, resisting the force that had no right to exist within its walls. The entity was no longer just a whisper, no longer just a presence lingering on the edge of thought. It was here, shaping itself from the darkness, warping the very fabric of reality with its arrival. Kaveth couldn't breathe. The air around him twisted, heavy with an unseen pressure that crushed against his ribs, his bones, his mind. The ship's lights flickered erratically, the power systems struggling against something they were never designed to withstand. The creature beside him, the one that had warned him, remained motionless, its helmet tilted slightly upward, watching. It didn't tremble. It didn't flinch. It only observed as if this was the moment it had been waiting for. The dark mass above them rippled. It was neither smoke nor shadow, neither solid nor fluid. It was something else, an impossible distortion that bled into existence like a wound in the fabric of time. It pulsed, slow and deliberate, as though testing the air, tasting the presence of those who dared to witness its emergence. Kaveth wanted to move. He wanted to run, but his body wouldn't obey. The ship systems were collapsing, warnings flashing across every remaining console, as if the vessel itself was trying to scream for help. Deep within its core, the power grid surged, then faltered, the artificial gravity flickering in unstable waves. And then the voice returned. Not a whisper this time. Not a distant murmur. It came like a force of nature, a tidal wave crashing against his mind. "You have opened the gate." Kaveth's vision blurred, his thoughts unraveling as the words dug into his skull. It was not a language he knew, not something spoken, but something imprinted, something forced upon him like a brand burned into his very existence. The ship's walls rippled outward, the space between atoms stretching, pulling apart. The mass above them twisted, coalescing, forming something. Limbs, or what could be called limbs, emerged in jagged, angular shapes, folding and unfolding in impossible configurations. Its face, if it had one, was an abyss, an absence of light so absolute that it hurt to look at. The creature beside Kaveth finally moved, stepping forward, its presence still unnervingly calm. It raised one hand, palm open toward the entity, as if in greeting. "I warned you," it murmured. Kaveth gasped for air, his chest tightening as the entity's attention shifted. It wasn't looking at the creature. It was looking at him. "You are the key." A sound like fractured glass echoed through the ship. Kaveth barely registered the sensation as his feet left the floor, the unseen force lifting him effortlessly. His claws flexed, his muscles strained, but there was nothing to fight, nothing to push against. He was weightless, suspended in the air like an offering. The entity reached toward him, and for the first time in his life, Kaveth felt something beyond fear, something deeper. An understanding. This thing was not a god. It was not a weapon. It was not something that had simply arrived. It had always been here, waiting beneath the surface of reality, watching, biding its time. And now, because of him, it was free. Kaveth's vision dimmed as the edges of his mind began to collapse, folding in on themselves under the weight of something too vast to contain. His body burned, his thoughts splintered, his consciousness stretched thin. And then, everything snapped. The lights died. The ship fell silent. The entity vanished. Kaveth hit the floor hard, his lungs convulsing as he sucked in a ragged breath. The walls were still. The air was still. The pulse of unnatural energy that had consumed the ship was simply gone. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then the creature turned to him. It knelt, its armor catching the dim emergency lights, the hollow void of its helmet angled downward as it studied him. When it spoke, its voice was different, no longer amused, no longer cryptic. Just cold. "It let you live." Kaveth shuddered, his body racked with exhaustion, his mind still trembling from the sheer force of what had just happened. He forced himself to speak. "Why?" The creature was quiet for a moment, and then it answered. "Because now it doesn't need to hide." A new noise filled the air, low, distant, but growing. Something was moving beyond the ship. And it was coming.